So thank you very much for having me. I want to thank my mentor, Raouf, and everybody, and the IMéRA in particular as well. So this is a paper with Rick van der Ploeg and Frédéric Toscani. So it's a paper that started on a very basic premise, which is that when we think about developing countries, we often think of them as resource rich. But in fact, when you look at the available data on the stock of wealth, and this is data from the World Bank on what they call natural capital, so the wealth that's under the ground, the subsoil assets per square kilometer. You could see from the table that Africa is actually resource poor from a stock standpoint when you compare it to the average per square kilometer in OECD country. So this sounded like something we should explore further, literally and figuratively. And so the point was that there is something to the wealth of the resource wealth that has to do with the degree in which countries are open. So it's a very basic point, and to me not very provocative, because if you think about the resource base as endogenous to how much effort we put in exploring it, if you think of the world as part of the world has been relatively closed, if you open it up, then you'll get more, you'll discover more, and therefore the resource base grows. So it's more of a north-south perspective of the old Pin Dyke and early Pin Dyke work on the topic. So this is from a stock standpoint. This is data from BP that's often used, rather casually, I should say. But interestingly, this is data on the evolution of proved reserves, so reserves that are deemed technically recoverable. And what you see is that, contrary to what the peak oil hypothesis has been positing, the reserve, the proven reserve of oil, are actually growing and not declining. And when you look a little deeper, you could see that non-OECD countries, so developing countries in general, are the lucky where these new resources are found. So not only the proved oil reserves are growing, but they are growing because of discoveries, if you wish, in the developing world. It's rather flat in OECD country. Some of it may be due indeed to new techniques, such as oil sand in Canada or shale oil in the US, which explains some of this increase in proved reserve. But in general, really the extensive margin of the increase is clearly from new discoveries in non-OECD countries. So these are the very basic facts that we stumbled on, and we felt we needed to explore further. So then when you take when you bring that to the issue related to what economists like to call institution, perhaps there are some political scientists in the room who are going to scream because institution is not very well defined, and we're going to get to that. But if you use the measure that some economists are using to quantify the degree of institution, and we can discuss what economists think institution, what are the basis for institution for economists are. But so these are the evolution of the various indices that we commonly use for different regions. So the OECD is the top line, and then you've got Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. And you could see that not only these reserves have been growing in non-OECD countries, but coincidentally also there was a narrowing of the institutional gap between OECD country and non-OECD country. This coincides with a period where my institution, the IMF, the World Bank, been very active in these countries in terms of helping this country open up, privatize, open their economy. So clearly a period, the end of the 80s, where radical change took place after crisis, period where a country turned to a market orientation. And we're going to discuss the different layers of institution, the one that are geared toward foreign investment, and the one that are geared toward locals and the citizenry. So clearly here, what the paper is going to be about is going to be about opening up to foreign investment, namely exploration. But the paper is not going to speak to the issue of internal, what I would describe as internal institution, the institution that cater to the welfare of the citizenry, and there could be some antagonistic view of why we will favor one as opposed to the other when describing institution in general. So these are casual evidence, but we're going to go deeper. So those are some country examples. If we in the paper we use a measure, a generic measure of openness, which is based on Sachs and Warner, which take a value of 1 when the country is deemed open, and we're going to see what they put in there. They have criteria based on tariff, so a certain level of tariff, black market premium, or whether or not the economy in general is oriented to a market. So clearly, if you take Peru before the opening up and after, clearly there's a big jump in the number of major discoveries, whether it's oil or minerals. So those are again anecdotal evidence. So what we do in this paper is we go back to the work of Pindijk on the notion that the resource base is endogenous to exploration, which is really, in some way, very tautological. But this environmental literature has been really developed in the context where, there were no borders and no north-south, and so it was just, purely micro, and the notion that if you dig, you'll find more, and therefore there's no reason to think that there is such a thing as proved reserve. It's just completely endogenous to how much effort you put in digging the stuff out.
However, there is a maximum level.
Yeah, of course. Economically, there is a maximum level. Geologically also.
But would you say that there is an infinite?
Yeah, amount? I would say that. Yeah.
You argue this.
Yeah, I mean infinite in the sense of compared to what we need. Yes, I mean, yeah. No, I agree that.
So there is no geological ingredient in the model. Or?
So, I mean, to some extent, indeed, there is a limit, but on economic term, clearly, there are elements that have to do with, digging deeper costs more, and therefore there's a maximum amount of exploration. But what I'm trying to argue is that these models typically assume a fixed endowment. But what I'm trying to argue is that yes, there is obviously it's not infinite, but clearly what we know of the subsoil is limited by factors that have to do with friction of sorts that are not just that have to do with cost, but not necessarily the cost you have in mind, and things, a country being closed, a country not being open for exploration and things of that nature. So there's a huge chunk of the economy of the subsoil that are out on the fringes and that are containing reserves which are not known.
That's exactly the point. You don't know exactly what you have in the soil.
Exactly. So geologically, indeed, there are different levels of what geologists would would call proven, or that they are susceptible reserve due to some element that point to that there could be a reserve under the ground. But if you take the concept that's commonly used, clearly we are far away from what, for instance, the US has managed to dig under the ground. So the US has, in spite of all its depletion, still has a lot more than Africa, and that's to me clearly showing that there is a huge endogeneity to the investment climate and things like that.
In your model, there is a peak or not?
Yeah, no, absolutely, James, there is. But so you made me think about when I say endogenous, yes, it's endogenous, but clearly not leading to any finite level. So, what we really do here is just take a north-south perspective on this well-known notion that the resource base is endogenous to exploration effort, and make the case that there are friction in the south that makes exploration not economical, if you wish, and therefore this limits how much discovery there is. And of course there are many other factors, demand from China, things that have to do with diminishing return to exploration in the north. So those factors, we balance this factor in the model, but the contribution is really to try and test and quantify how important the institutional channel is. And we find that it's quantitatively important, of course, over and above the other factors that are also important.
Competing factors? What are the competing factors in the institutional channel?
So demand, so prices.
Technology?
No, we don't have any technology there. We can discuss that at the end. Obviously, the gorilla in the room is shell oil. We can talk about that toward the end. But we abstract from technology to the extent. I mean, you are a specialist, but there is an issue of diffusion of technology. But we will assume that data is a public good, and there's no friction. But of course it has important relevance. But to the extent that these activities are conducted by foreign firms who have access to the technology, one could argue these friction are less important. They may compound, they may magnify the institutional channel. But we have not introduced that. So again, some more facts, maybe a bit more systematic using the data we have. So, sorry, I'm not speaking in the microphone. So really what we are documenting in the paper is this north-south shift in resource, or known resource wealth. And we are showing that the timing of that shift coincide with the opening up of these economies. Okay, good. So this is the data we have. So it's a novel data set on major discoveries of minerals and hydrocarbon resources. So as you can see from the chart, So this is the increase over the decades for the high-income country, and it's declining significantly. And for sub-Saharan Africa, it's increasing, in Latin America. So really, these discoveries have been on the decline in most OECD countries. And on the rise for the southern countries. This is the evolution of the number of discovery worldwide. I think for Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, I think. And this is the evolution of the indicator of openness that we use. And you see the coincidence between the evolution of the share of discoveries worldwide in these two regions and the evolution of the average openness. This is a simple event analysis, and the vertical line shows the timing of openness, and that's an average response. And you could see clearly that before the average level of number of discovery prior to opening up for an average country in a sample is much lower than after. So in a sense, that's what the regression are going to do. Let me take a step back and go to the related literature to try and make clear what the contribution of this paper is. So so we argue that this shift in global unknown resource wealth or global resource wealth is not completely new. There are many instances in history. Take the US at the time of the so-called gold rush. Clearly, it has been documented by economic historians that as rights were granted to jumpers, this led to a rush, and indeed these discoveries of abundant gold that led to a spur in migration and development in areas that were otherwise called the Wild West. So clearly, this is also the case when you look at the colonial era. There is this famous paper by Lucas on why doesn't capital flow from rich to poor country, and he takes the episode of the colonial era to argue that during the colonial era, the time when colonial power imposed their rule on their colony, capital was indeed freely flowing from the north to the south. And I just came back from Morocco. Most of the phosphate mines date back from the time of the French colonial era. They were an era where when capital was flowing freely, they were indeed exploration effort, transfers of technology potentially that led to discovery. Obviously, this is very controversial because it was not on a competed basis, and there is also this aspect of what of the locals, and which I'm going to discuss later. But clearly, this shift in resource wealth, many of the geologists I speak to tell me that the French, the English, and others still to this day have very important information that date back from the colonial era on where are the massive reserve resources, and what we, the geologists, have built dates back from that original geological surveys of sorts, discoveries, exploration effort, was somewhat unconstrained by the release of some of these barriers for good and bad reason, and so this led to knowledge of an expanding knowledge of what we know about the resources, and which points to the institutional channel of resource wealth. So this is again obviously related to the Pindike work, and but I should argue that the Pindike work is not that mainstream, if you wish, in environmental economics, to the extent that we do indeed assume a fixed resource base in many of the existing literature. So It also relates to an older literature, also dating from North and others in economics, which are certainly revisiting existing work in political science and other ways, but pointing to the importance of institution in development. So clearly, this influential paper by Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, arguing over the deep root of institution dated back from again the colonial era, make the case that institutions do matter quite importantly in driving development. So clearly, here what we are arguing is that, as others have shown, institutions drive development, but they also drive resource endowment. So to some extent, this is important because, as I have shown in the first table, clearly if we think Africa is resource rich today, we can easily imagine that a lot more is to come as this country open up, and this raised the issue of how to manage these resources and how to harness the power of this reserve and utilize them for their own welfare. So clearly an important strand of literature pointing to the primacy of institution for development. But what I'm going to argue is, of course, that one should unbundle this institution and try to argue that there are some institutions that are geared toward foreign investment and attract investment, lead to more reserve, but that doesn't necessarily translate into appropriate exploitation of these resources and appropriate extraction of the rent for the welfare of the local. So I think that a discussion we can have toward the end. There's also an important strand of literature on the role of political risk and expropriation in the context of the resource sector. And the closest paper in spirit is this paper by Kirsten Harding, which focuses on oil and utilize a so-called regression discontinuity, basically exploiting information on both sides of the border, which basically starts from this observation that if you look at the frontier between Congo, I think, DRC and Uganda, so you could see that discoveries were made on the side of the Ugandan border, but clearly geology tells us that this basin run from, indiscriminately between both sides of the border, and the fact that these discoveries were made here and not on the other side does potentially tell us something about
the period of that.
These are recent discoveries, I think.
On the other side there is war, right?
Yeah, but so that's probably part of the story as well.
2002 and after actually.
Yeah, but so the point is that this is their paper. They're making the point that they are exploiting this discontinuity to argue that institutions play a role. Again, institution understood in a broad sense. But so for those who are not familiar with this, with this nightlight, so satellite observation of nightlights. So basically, electricity from the sky shows the difference between North Korea and South Korea, and clearly it looks awfully dark in South Korea. So some, of course, economists have went on to use satellite observation of nightlight to argue that this is a close correlate to GDP, and therefore there's a whole literature.
It's not the same time in the northern side.
Yes. So but clearly, this is not meant in really in a bad way. But clearly, at least you could really look at different institutional settings and different economic performance, and clearly that work has shown that institution, again, yet to be defined in a way that I think is appropriate. For case, we are really focusing on institutions that are geared toward opening up toward foreign investment, and I insist on that, and I'm going to tell you why later. There is an important element that does confound the notion that development is in large part explained by these differences in institution, and we are yet to unbundle these to understand what can be done about this conclusion. I'm not going to dwell on the Pin Dyke extension we've done. Yeah, but it's basically starting from this micro aspect of the resource base between endogenous to exploration, and taking this in a two region setting, north and south. The south has friction in the form of tax, which render costly exploration, and on top of that you have prices, and you also have marginal cost increasing as you extract. So you've got different forces, and the model has prediction which are pretty straightforward, and which we explore. That the higher the tax in the south, the less discoveries, the more demand from, say, China or India, the higher the prices, and therefore more discoveries worldwide. And some other factor could also predict potentially that north-south shift. So as you deplete, quote and unquote, in the north, that should raise the cost of exploring in the north, and therefore there should be a natural shift to the south, everything else being equal. But here we argue that on top of that natural shift, because of digging deeper in the north costs more, and therefore this leads to more investment in the south. On top of that, the gradual opening up of the south has led to that shift.
The taxes, are they corporate taxes?
Yeah, they are taxes on international oil corporation.
Many of these companies exploiting, they're usually multinational companies.
Yes.
And they do a lot of transfer.
Absolutely. Very good point. Yes.
Taxes.
Yeah, they don't pay taxes, but of course, the tax here is in a model without information asymmetry, and is just to capture the notion that there are risks associated with, or costs associated with extracting or exploring in the south, and therefore there is that the tax is just a modeling tool to capture that friction that the south is perceived as more risky or more expensive to. But in practice, going to explore in Congo, say that doesn't have to do with the tax code or the tax exemption that Congo is going to bring. It's going to have to do with whether or not the signal that the government sent is credible. And what our argument is that if you lower tariff, if you agree to the WTO, if you make commitment that have to the multilateral community, those are much more credible and somewhat irreversible commitment than bilateral deals with a company. So that's why we didn't stick to indeed looking at the level of the fiscal terms that are offered.
And you use stationary tax rate, not effective tax rates. The stationary tax rates.
Or the statutory, you mean? Or you mean the... no, so we departed from that and really used our indicator of openness as the relevant measure because of the very reason you...
We can leave the most important questions for after. We can proceed.
Sure. So, so the mechanism behind this shift is really has to do with this commitment that these countries are making to these to the international community in the form of lowering tariffs and granting stability of terms, which makes them open to foreign investment and therefore lead to more exploration and investment. So clearly, I'm not going to go through the econometric strategy, but we really have a novel data set, and we explore the relationship between the number of major discoveries for a specific commodity in a specific country at a specific time. And I think what's novel as well is that it is always challenging to go from an association between improved institution or improved market orientation and more discovery. So we went on to design an instrumental viable strategy, and we use this Econometric paper by IMéRA, which is based on the basic notion that, say, if Morocco opens up and does well, this might, to some extent, influence Algeria's policies toward openness because the neighbors is opening up and doing well. So we exploit the seemingly exogenous variation from neighbors' policies and their successful and conditional that they are successful. This gives us potentially a source of variation that allows us to isolate a causal relationship between opening up in a given country and more discovery. So
do you include countries like Congo or things like this?
Yeah, of course.
But if a region is in war, well, why including it? You know that there is no way to explore anything when you have people shooting.
Oh, but what do you mean? No, so this is a broad sample. We include all the countries. We want variation. And we want these cases where institutions are really poor, and we want the one where
this is
very
more
rich.
poor. This is simply
that's what Econometric is about. We want variation.
It's an outlier for me, but you include it.
Yeah, but there's different philosophy about outliers. Some like outliers, some remove them. So, but clearly, this is absolutely robust to using a shorter sample and things of that nature. But the good news is that we can go beyond the IMéRA association and talk about causality between opening up and the number of discoveries. So I'm going to skip all this, and so these are the results. So take it that we are finding that there is a robust causal relationship between opening up and the number of discoveries. So clearly what we verify, so this is based on discoveries. We also use data on exploration spending, which do not necessarily yield discoveries, and we verify the channel. So we find that over and above changes in prices, changes in this increase in the cost associated with more discoveries prior to that one, controlling for these other channels, other factors. We find that also in the case of exploration spending, there's more exploration spending as the country open up. We quantify the relationship between opening up and discovery, and find that if you conduct a thought experiment whereby countries in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa were to move to the best or the most open or the best institution in the region, you would have an increase of 15% of the number of mine discovered worldwide. And if we were to jump to the level of the US, you would have an increase in the number of discoveries in the region by 25%. So we find evidence that this institutional channel is not alone. There are other factors at play, but if you single that factor out, it is economically significant.
Just a very small question.
Yeah.
Is some difference between metal and oil discoveries?
Oh yeah, good question. So conceptually, one would argue that oil, since it's transported through pipelines, should be less sensitive to issues that have to do with institution. So we do not find evidence that this is the case. We find that the result both hold for mineral and metals. I think this is one of the slides. So we split the sample and the result do hold as well. We use different measure of institution. We do a variety of robustness. So the conclusion is that to a large extent, known resource wealth is endogenous to institutional factors, especially to the degree of openness of the country. There is a challenging issue, which is this notion that there's a well-known literature on the resource curse that documents the link between having resources and poor economic performance. Our result does not contradict the fact that discoveries could lead to conflict or things of that nature. It really is more upstream. It's more about what triggers potential discoveries. What countries do with these discoveries have to do with other type of institution, and I think that's where more research needs to be done. And potentially, if you take the example of Venezuela today, it's the country that sits on the biggest, perhaps biggest reserve of oil worldwide, but its production is declining, and that has to do with the state capacity of Venezuela that has been over the years declining as engineers went to Colombia and other places, and potentially rules, incentive structures have changed in a way that led to a difficult period for the sector, and on top of the country's policy to redistribute. So potentially there is this tension between redistribution and opening up to foreigner. Opening up to foreigner brings you foreign capital, potentially raise production, but what you do with this rent or how you capture that rent has to do with fiscal terms, domestic institutions that have to do more with redistribution politics, if you wish. And therefore there is this tension that I think one needs to go deeper into. And so the shift is complex, as I just mentioned. There are elements of state capacity which have nothing to do with, so you could be Congo and you could guarantee a foreign company that it can operate and exploit these resources. So to take your example, there could be this dissonance between, a country that is going through difficult time but has absolutely guaranteed terms to the extent that it can. So there is this tension, and we see countries like that have indeed discovered a lot, but not necessarily translated that in terms of development. To limit global warming to below 2 degrees, this has implication for the resources, the reserves that are known today. And one of the risks that many of these countries face, especially for fossil fuel reserve, is that to some extent, if you do the math, you could argue that a large chunk of the existing reserve cannot be burned if we would like to stay below the 2 degrees. So since it's a credible commitment, you could argue that some countries are, so these are the nationally determined commitment to stay below the 2 degrees. So a recent article in Nature point to the fact that the Middle East or Canada and others will have to to not burn, to not exploit for the Middle East 40% of its distributors. So this causes a number of issues for countries, the so-called risk of stranded asset. It's an issue that has also led to this dissonance between why is it that there is this run to discover more stuff at the time when it seems we cannot burn it all. The existing stock of stuff is not enough, is more than enough, and we keep on going with these discoveries. So are these countries running into a dead end, or is it that the agreement is not credible? You know, there is, I think, issues there over where we're going. And I'm going to end it here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.